Welcome, everyone, to Thinking Through Art and Design at Berkeley, Responsible Design from Bits to Buildings. My name is Bjorn Hartmann. I'm one of the co-organizers of the speaker series and also one of the co-instructors for the associated course. Arts and Design Thursdays at BAMPFA are made possible thanks to support from the Big Ideas course program in the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley and from generous supporters of Berkeley Arts and Design. And in-kind support is also provided by BAMPFA. Today's topic is Design for Democracy. And we have two UC Berkeley faculty with us today for this conversation. Our first speaker is Niloufar Salehi. She's an assistant professor at the School of Information at UC Berkeley, and she received her PhD in computer science from Stanford. Her research interests are in social computing, technologically mediated collective action, digital labor, and more broadly, human-computer interaction. Her research has been published and has received awards in all of the most selective venues in her field. Through building computational social systems, through running controlled experiments, and through ethnographic fieldwork, her research contributes to the design of alternative social configurations online. Her work has been used at companies like Mozilla and has led to the publishing of the first set of guidelines for doing ethical research on the crowdsourcing platform Mechanical Turk. And these guidelines are in use at Berkeley and at many other universities internationally, and hundreds of researchers have signed on to them. After Niloufar, we'll hear from Eric Paulos. He's an associate professor in electrical engineering and computer sciences at UC Berkeley, where he leads his research group, the Hybrid Ecologies Lab. He's the director of the new Masters of Design program at Berkeley, director of the Citrus Invention Lab, the chief learning officer at the Jacobs Institute for Design Innovation, and he's part of the Berkeley Center for New Media. Before coming to Berkeley, Eric was faculty at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon, where he also had a faculty appointment in the Robotics Institute. Prior to CMU, Eric was here at Berkeley. He was a research scientist at Intel Research in Berkeley, and before that, received his PhD from UC Berkeley in EECS. His area of expertise is design research, urban computing, sustainability, social telepresence, physical computing, interaction design, and persuasive technologies. Please help me in welcoming both Niloufar and Eric. Today's schedule will work roughly like this. I've invited both speakers to give us an overview of 20 to 30 minutes of their relevant research and projects that touch on different interpretations of design for democracy. And after that, we'll continue the event with a conversation on stage where I will have some questions, but I also invite all of you during the talk to think about questions that you would like to hear us discuss. Thank you, and welcome, Niloufar.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about some of my work and hear everything that's going on here. So today I'm going to be mostly talking about designing socio-technical systems that support collective action and community accountability. And I'm going to talk about three main things. How systems can help, so how these online systems can help collectives build strong networks, how they can provide support to move online efforts forward when they stall, and what can we do when things go wrong and people purposefully harm other people on the internet. And I did all of this work together with the communities that were affected by it. I did the first project that I'm going to talk about with accessibility advocates on Mozilla, the second one with worker rights advocates on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the third one with community moderators and restorative and transformative justice activists. I'd like to start with a very short story, a vignette, to show the depth of the kind of problems that we're dealing with in designing for democracy and what we can do about them. This problem has to do with harassment on Twitter that unfortunately includes things like death and rape threats that are very common and are frequently used in a concerted way to silence people. And you or someone you may know may have been a target of this harassment. And this is an issue that many people have very strong feelings about, and they're determined to act on. It stifles people's freedom of expression and speech and sort of forces them to silence or to close down their accounts and leave. And so many people feel strongly about this. They want to do something about it, and they have taken some actions. So there is a change.org petition that specifically asks Twitter to shut down accounts that tweet threats at other people. It has almost 400,000 signatures. And at some point, the actress Rose McGowan spoke out against Harvey Weinstein's sexual harassment for the first time on Twitter. She tweeted about something that had happened. She included identifiable information about Harvey Weinstein, and that caused Twitter to suspend her account because apparently that was against the terms of service. This caused a lot of outrage because of the situation that was existing, and people felt like there's already a lot of hate speech and threats on this platform that even when the report goes unchecked, and then someone who's actually speaking out against harassment is the one that's getting shut down. So people tried to organize a boycott around it. They chose a hashtag, they picked a date. It was hashtag Women Boycott Twitter, and they broadcast it through quite a number of high-profile celebrities. But the effort itself was actually quite controversial. There were some people who boycotted the boycott. Other people made counter hashtags, such as Women of Color affirmation. Twitter promised to make changes, but they also said they have limited resources, and the whole thing fizzled. Why? I'm going to argue that there are two main reasons. The first was that there was a lack of trust in the action. So especially among women of color, trans women, people who felt like they were more frequently a target of harassment, and when they had talked out about it, no one had done anything, but now they were suddenly expected to participate in a boycott. In particular, one person said, "If this is the event that has activated your awareness, I don't particularly trust you." The second reason was that the effort stalled because there was friction among potential supporters of the effort, so people who felt very strongly about this and wanted to do something, but they felt maybe a boycott wasn't an appropriate way to protest the silencing of women. And I'll come back to this specific issue a little later, but what I wanted to demonstrate here more generally was that even highly motivated collectives facing these kinds of open-ended, complex challenges that they feel strongly about often fail to envision shared outcomes and act on them. And to unpack this group of people with shared issues are very similar to what we would call a public. Publics are also used a lot in design by people like DeSalvo and LeDontek at Georgia Tech, mostly to mean groups rallying around shared issues that affect them. And what differentiates these particular groups that we're talking about today is that they're also trying to act together. So they're doing the work of deliberation, coordination, collaboration, deciding and arguing between alternative plans of action and facing failure. And that's because of the nature of the challenges that they face. These are challenges that are messy, interdependent, and risky, and sound a lot like what we in design usually call wicked problems. The phrase wicked problems actually comes out of urban planning, and it's frequently used in design thinking to talk about problems that are difficult or impossible to solve because there are just too many moving parts. The problem changes as you try to solve it, and this makes the whole problem, the goal, and the path to solving it unclear. So what I'm proposing in this talk is how can we design to support publics working together on wicked problems? And we know from prior literature that the basis for a group to be able to work on a wicked problem together is that they need to know each other and they need to trust one another. Familiarity is one term that I'm going to use a lot today, and it's a term coming out of social psychology and organizational behavior that basically describes how well people know each other. Sometimes it's measured as how long have they been working together, for instance. And this is really important for collective action because familiar groups know each other, so they know their strengths and weaknesses. They develop situated knowledge of who knows what, and this enables them to strategize and coordinate action. Familiarity can sometimes also lead to trust if everything goes well, and this increases psychological safety. So groups that have high psychological safety are more comfortable taking risks together. And finally, groups that are familiar share knowledge, and this leads to collective sense-making and the development of a shared identity or a shared set of goals. So for these online collectives that are very motivated to work on a problem that they all face together, they actually need to first know each other and they need to have familiarity and trust among themselves. But rather than build that, the kinds of existing infrastructure that we have are designed around these engagement metrics or these atomic fast-paced interactions. Research in HCI has actually shown that what on social media increases tie strength or familiarity between people is having conversations with them. But if you think about the kinds of systems or tools that we're building and putting out there, the kinds of things that are rewarded on those environments are these instant likes, retweets, things that get a lot of attention, things that are outrageous or sensational. And so in doing so, the environments that we're participating in are actually incentivizing us to have flyby disagreements and disincentivizing us from having actual difficult conversations and growing together. So how can we design alternative socio-technical configurations that sort of push back against this? What is the counter to all of this? And my main goal today is designing alternative environments that actually scaffold and guide social interactions toward building networks that can help people form publics and work together on the wicked problems that they face together. That sounds really hard. How are we going to do that? I'm going to show you through 3 projects that I've worked on some of the steps that we can take towards that goal. So the first step is to bring people together and build networks of familiarity. So we want to encourage people to talk to the same small group of people over time so that they get to know them, but at the same time we want to balance this with building a network, reaching out and having conversations with new people who can bring diverse perspectives. And that's the goal of the first project that I'm going to briefly talk about today, Hive, which I did with accessibility advocates on Mozilla. But even when you have that, even when you have that familiarity and trust, efforts can still get stuck, for instance, when people have disagreements. And I've worked on designing structured human support that can help move efforts forward when they stall because of those disagreements. Dynamo is a system that I built in collaboration with worker rights advocates on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And finally, inevitably, things do go wrong, and people do, on purpose, harm each other. And so I've worked on how restorative and transformative justice can be used as frameworks for designing around accountability. Through these 3 projects, I want to convince you that if we pay particular attention to a collective's relationships of trust and accountability, we can design social computing systems that actually assist that collective in getting to a place where they can act together. First, I'm going to talk about Hive. And here we're mostly talking about very early stages of collective action. We want people to do the work of deliberation, understanding and articulating a problem, and collectively imagining goals and paths forward to alternative futures. I designed a method that I'm going to talk about today called network rotation, which is a computational method. It organizes conversations by balancing how strong your ties are to someone who you're speaking to at the moment and how tightly knit the overall network is. So are we also doing the work of network building? So with network rotation, what we're trying to do is get people to share their ideas, but also be exposed to different perspectives while keeping the psychological safety of the group high. And I'll explain what this all means. So I'll start with an example. Imagine you have a big problem, like the one we already talked about, harassment on Twitter. The way our current social computing infrastructure mostly works is that each person will come out and say the first thing that comes to their mind. One person might want to boycott Twitter for a day. Someone else might want to actually share all our stories for a day. And another person might say, well, actually, we need to be recording the harassment. And these ideas are often different, and they're often not very good, because they fail to incorporate other people's viewpoints and constraints. And because of this drawback, HCI literature has looked into different ways that we can encourage people to intermix their ideas. Usually this is done through a big gallery or a map of everyone's ideas. And what we would do is take the person who came up with the boycott idea, show them some other idea out there, like the recording idea, and ask them to intermix these 2. Usually in practice what happens is that the person who came up with the boycott idea will come back and say, no, my idea was better. And the reason for this, drawing on research in communication theory and organizational behavior, is that in the real world, just being exposed to other people's ideas, if they're different from our own, doesn't actually influence us that much. And we're much more influenced by other people's viewpoints when we engage and we talk to them and we actually get to know them. Knowledge is situated. It's not something that's in my head and I can pass on to you. It's actually developed in the context of our social relations and as we engage with each other. So instead of intermixing ideas, my idea here was to intermix people. In one study, one very famous study, researchers found that when they showed a real-world team working on a complex problem, a piece of paper with ideas from another team that was working on the exact same problem, they actually didn't pay attention to those ideas. It had no influence on them. But when they tried another thing, when they took a person from one team and added them to the other team, it did influence them. It actually significantly improved their output. So engaging in conversations with people can lead to better ideas that dig deeper into a problem. And this is the insight that Hive is based on. To make this possible at the scale of a big network, I'm going to propose what I've termed network rotation. So this is an idea where instead of everyone talking to everyone as if this whole room is staring at one giant whiteboard, we would actually divide people into smaller teams where they could engage in real conversation. And then iteratively over time, we weaved people together from different parts of the collaboration network. And this would help facilitate the spread of different viewpoints and ideas in the collective. There are many, many different ways to reorganize a network in this way, and I've worked on how can we do this intelligently. So I'll just briefly talk about what are the conditions for an effective network rotation that my research has shown. The first is that we want people to build familiarity and psychological safety. So we want people to talk with the same small group of people over time. The second is we want to balance this with people engaging with diverse or new perspectives. So I actually hypothesized that balancing these two needs would be better than or more effective than strategizing to maximize one over the other. And I did this through the network rotation algorithm. What it basically does is it balances familiarity, which I measured as tie strength. So between two people, the more number of days that they're in the same team together or working together, the higher their tie strength. And it balances this with the structure of the overall network. So imagine instead of having these silos where each group is working on their own thing, you would actually have a mixture of people. So you would have a more tightly knit network. I did 2 deployments with this system to see if it actually works. I'm going to show you that through a controlled experiment, we actually found that when we put a large group of people through network rotation, the team submitted better design proposals for a problem that they had. It didn't reduce psychological safety that much. And then we used it in a real-world deployment with Mozilla accessibility advocates. And they did a week-long design drive using the system. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is very briefly is the controlled experiment. We had we did a controlled experiment where on one side we had teams that were static, on another we had teams that were constantly moving around, so we were increasing people's exposure to diverse perspectives. And then on the third condition, we actually had people who went through network rotation. We found that network rotation improved over the baseline, but network efficiency didn't. So this suggests that if you look at the top, maybe 60% of the top third of ideas were all in the network rotation condition. And this suggests that when we're moving people around in these conversations, we not only want to consider their familiarity with the people they're immediately talking to, but also the structure of the overall network. Now, one thing we did worry about was that all this moving people around and having them have to start with a new team was going to make people feel less comfortable contributing if they're always talking to strangers, for instance. And this might make the whole process too disruptive. So we looked at a measure called psychological safety. This is a measure of the perceived ability to take risks in a team. It's a standard survey. It has a bunch of questions like, members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. Or we might ask you, working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So this is a survey. It has 50 questions. And after every round of this project, we would give people the survey to fill out. What we wanted to see was when people participated in network rotation and they had to change who they were talking about, did this reduce their psychological safety? One thing we found was that for the people who were in the team themselves and other people who were moving around, it had no effect. So they were pretty comfortable with the team. However, for the people who were moving around, it did decrease their psychological safety a little bit, especially later on. So when people got attached to a group of people, it was hard for them to move. And what this shows is that actually moving people around, having them build new connections is really costly, and it's important to do this in an effective way. So I showed that network rotation is effective we also wanted to see would people actually do this in the real world. So we partnered up with Mozilla's Open Innovation team. They issued an open call to their communities of volunteers and accessibility enthusiasts, asking them to participate in a week-long design drive. The goal of the design drive was to reimagine an accessible web browsing experience. We reached out and we offered people with disabilities $150 gift cards to lend their expertise to the project and participate in these design teams as team leads and experts. One thing that we learned was that this was a week-long online effort. There were people from all around the world. There was very little attrition. So out of more than 100 people who joined, 6 people dropped out by the end of the week. People got really engaged and really heavily involved in their work. They, on average, posted 1,000 lines of chat a day. And to give you a sense of the kinds of proposals that they ended up with at the end of this drive, I'll show you 2 examples. So one was finding ways to interact with a computer that is similar to sign language. So one member of this team actually knew sign language, and she was talking about how in communities of people who sign, they consistently reconfigure gestures to mean new things. And she wanted a way to be able to teach this to the computer so that something that she wants to do a lot with a computer, she could just come up with a gesture for it. Nodding could mean save the current file, or a gesture that is a nickname for a friend could mean send an email or a text message to that friend. Another was reactive interfaces. These are interfaces that understand when you're having a problem with them, and they might react and try to make what you're doing easier. So, for instance, for people who have mobility disabilities and they can't seem to click on a button, it might enlarge that button. These proposals were all reviewed by Mozilla's accessibility team. They gave all of the groups feedback, and they chose 4 of them that they were interested in pursuing further, and one of them was voice-based interaction systems. I want to talk really briefly about what we learned during this process. So one of the things that we learned was that participants told us that new members who came onto their team brought fresh perspectives, and they allowed for more ideas to come into the room. One person said meeting new people was great, mixing ideas was very helpful, especially as people dropped in and out later in the week. But while these fresh perspectives were exciting and helpful, people showed concern about losing out on the ties that they had already built with an old team. So one person said, I liked bringing in fresh ideas every day. It gave a different or new perspective, but sometimes you build good working relationships with others and you don't want to lose them. And finally, we found that the anonymity that the system provided made people more comfortable to share stories that they might not otherwise be comfortable doing so. So one of our participants who actually had a disability said, wow, that didn't even feel like an hour. I'm loving this. This is stuff I never talk about. It's helping me realize some things about myself that I didn't know before I started talking about it here. Thank you all. So with Hive, I just demonstrated that it's possible to create environments for collectives to come together, build familiarity, and generate plans and proposals for action. Hive was designed for groups that have a common cause but don't really know each other yet. Dynamo, in contrast, was something that I designed for and together with people who did know each other, and familiarity was actually contributing to their problem. To present Dynamo, I'm going to go back to the argument that I made at the beginning, that many collective action efforts online never succeed. And we already went through one reason why that might happen, which was a lack of trust and familiarity. But friction can happen despite familiarity. The collective that I worked with here, people who work on Amazon Mechanical Turk, often known as Turkers, consisted of multiple tightly knit communities that had disagreements and animosity in the past. And these were all completely online communities. So these people had never met. A lot of them didn't even know each other's real names, but they had been around for more than 5 years, sometimes even a decade. They had come up with a name for the kinds of problems that they had in their community of practice. They called it megadrama. So with Dynamo, we wanted to support collective efforts despite these kinds of animosities that happened online. I engaged with these Mechanical Turk workers through a year of ethnographic fieldwork. Together, we created a system called Dynamo. I'll start by going really quickly over the kinds of challenges that they had in their environment that necessitated this kind of collective action. The kinds of systems that have been created, like Amazon Mechanical Turk, have sort of created this labor market that leaves many people working online struggling to find good work and to assert their rights when they're mistreated, because they're mostly invisible within these systems. And to push back on that, they've actually formed collectives online using very basic web forums. They use these forums and chat rooms to share good work or to talk to employers, or even sometimes I saw them raise money for a fellow Turker in need. And these forums were really effective at coordinating efforts when the effort was not controversial and when individual action still had an effect. But I found that they struggled more when people had really complex problems where the goal or how to get to it was not clear and required debate, when many hands were needed to share the burden. And I found that they talked a lot about these issues, but they had trouble taking the next step. And this is essentially the same as the challenge that the Twitter users were having when they had friction over tactics, and this caused the whole effort to fizzle. So the question is, how can we support an online collective, not just to discuss, but to agree on a common goal and execute it? And together we created Dynamo to answer that question. We had an interactive and iterative process. We built an online platform. We launched it in July 2014. People submitted 22 ideas for action, and 2 of them turned into campaigns. We had some design decisions that we made to make this a space that was good for collective action. One of it was that people wanted to be anonymous because they wanted to act without fear of retaliation from their employer, but they also wanted to trust other members. So we had a whole system set up where registration on the platform required some confirmation, but you would still have a pseudonymous username. One of the things that happened on Dynamo was that people created an ethical guideline for research on Mechanical Turk. And this was triggered by an incident where a well-meaning researcher injected false information into a reviewing system for Mechanical Turk. This caused a lot of frustration among Turkers because they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was happening. They thought someone was spamming them, and when it was all done, there was a lot of drama. Turkers agreed that researchers lacked exposure to the kinds of issues and vulnerabilities they faced as Turkers, and they wanted to do something about it. They thought maybe we could write guidelines for ethical research on our community, and that these guidelines could be both a means to guide ethical behavior and to back Turker claims when things go wrong. But there's a big gap between wanting ethical guidelines and actually creating them and having everyone agree on them. And we created socio-technical infrastructure that included ideas and voting and mobilizing to help do that. But despite all of the design decisions that we made and the really good system that we thought we had created, these efforts still almost failed, multiple times. They faced 2 common failure scenarios, stalling and friction. And these are common pitfalls that I'm going to argue any online action might fall into. Stalling happened when an effort just lost momentum and stopped. And this was usually because the next steps were difficult to identify or it was too much work for an individual to accomplish. For instance, one effort on Dynamo was a letter writing campaign that stalled after weeks of discussion. But stalling is still in many ways better than friction, and that's when there is active criticism and negative emotion targeted at an effort's progress. For instance, with the guidelines effort, one person was disappointed at a certain paragraph, other people disagreed, and this turned into a whole flaming argument on the internet, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So stalling and friction are these twin pitfalls, and I'm going to argue that they're inherent challenges to any online community that wants to act. To avoid stalling, people need to do something, they need to act. But acting can backfire if other people disagree with what you did, which causes friction. To address friction reduces motivation in the people who are getting critiqued, and that can lead to stalling. So in other words, these are 2 big problems. Trying to fix one of them often causes the other, and it seems like online collectives have far more reasons to fail at acting together than to succeed. When Dynamo Actions faced these pitfalls, we actually stepped in and we performed the labor that was necessary to preserve the forward motion of the movement. And we call this the labor of action. I'm going to go through 2 of the mechanisms that, for instance, that we used a lot. One of them was debates with deadlines, and that's when there would be this big argument, and I would step in and say, what if we set a deadline for making a decision about it? Like, we're going to make a decision by Friday. And usually people agreed that it would be good to wrap things up. Another one was acting and undoing, which is when we would make an action, but we would leave space for people to disagree and undo our action if necessary. So did these mechanisms actually help? After about a month of work, Turkers finally published the Guidelines for Ethical Research on Labor Day 2014. It's available online as a 23-page write-up. It covers things like fair payment and respecting Turker privacy, and it has 261 signatures by researchers and Turkers. We've also seen people reference it in tasks and in research papers. Another group started a collective effort, which was a letter writing campaign to Jeff Bezos. 30 people posted their letters publicly, and they got action on some of the things that they had asked for in the letters. It was also covered by major news outlets, including The Guardian and The Daily Beast. So to conclude, Dynamo was about how structured labor, the labor of action, can help these movements overcome the challenges of stalling and friction and move forward. And what's important here is the labor of action cannot be written into code. It requires contextual knowledge, familiarity with the members and of the public and their goals, and it also requires identified, trustworthy actors who are familiar with the constraints of the environment. And so I would encourage us to think about how we can center the labors that, combined with software, can actually bring about change, and how can we better support those labors. So I described two systems that I've designed and deployed. The project that I'm currently working on, Good Twitter, is a project about restorative justice, which is an indigenous practice that's about bringing back, it's about designing a process that when harm happens or when someone perpetuates harm to someone else, they are given the opportunity to be held accountable, change their actions, repair the damage that they have done, and it also allows victims, bystanders, and communities the chance to address systemic problems. So this is sort of the opposite of what we're doing right now, which is a punitive model of justice, where when someone does something wrong, they're either removed from the environment, or at least their speech is removed from the environment. And so one thing that I'm working on right now is working with community moderators and activists of restorative and transformative justice, trying to think about what would it look like if our online environments actually started from this position of restorative justice, and then we started designing systems of accountability around that. Transformative justice is very similar to restorative justice, but it's more concerned about the root causes and comprehensive outcomes. It recognizes that violence committed by an individual emerges out of a social context. And so the community that this harm happened in is responsible and capable of changing the social conditions that cause that harm to happen. In our work, we are imagining fundamentally new ways to address the problems of online harm by starting from this viewpoint. So in this talk, I argued that to support publics working together on the wicked problems that they face collectively, we will need to design social computing systems that center trust, familiarity, and accountability. And through Dynamo and Hive, and very brief explanation of what we're working on with Good Twitter, I demonstrated that human labor, computational models, and theories of justice are all important parts of socio-technical system design. Thank you.
We'll do all of the Q&A after.
Do you need the charger?
So, at this point, I'll ask Eric Paul. Hopefully, switch.
I know, but I'm going to move around, I realized. Okay, I'm going to move around a little bit. All right, thanks. This is a great forum, and how appropriate that even today, if you guys follow things, there was some news about our own California legislator pushing in for legislation around workers' rights and around some new ways that places like Uber are pushing back on. So it's really even today. So this is amazing because Nilüfer has such a deep insights into many things that I think we could have benefited from when I was doing some of this work at the time. And so I'm really love the way that she looks at these particular issues. I'm going to bring you back for a minute because I wanted to go back and think about some work that I had done with some of my students a number of years ago on citizen science and kind of participatory kind of democracy with technology and mobile devices. So some of these slides are going to show their age, but rather than replace everything, I thought I would rather give you a perspective of how we approach some of these problems. And I'm really proud of the work, but also I know you will critique the work. So you should have no problem finding gaps and missing points. And so that could be a really good starting point for our discussion. So citizen science, you're probably familiar with this. This is a picture from 1956. And this is a group called Operation Moonwatch, started by Fred Whipple. Now, these people, you may not know what they're doing, but they're actually trying to watch satellites pass overhead. And if you're thinking and you're doing your math right, this is before Sputnik was even launched. So those people are preparing for an event that hasn't even happened or cannot even happen. And in fact, when Sputnik did launch, that citizen group had more knowledge about tracking Sputnik than the governments. And that's kind of the spirit of who has the power, who has the knowledge, who has the data, who can help influence decisions, who's part of the discussion, how kind of inclusive can we be about that. Here's another example. Here's supernova 2008 HA. The remarkable thing about this is the discoverer, Carolyn Moore. So she's a high school student that discovered this quite amazing supernova. I spent a little bit of time this morning trying to figure out where she is now, because this has been 2008. She got to meet with President Obama, all kinds of very cool things. She even inspired me. This is the only slides that I inserted into this. I went and got a telescope, and this summer was out trying to look for my own supernova and other things. But I think this is the kind of spirit of this rise of the expert amateur. And this cuts across not only some of the mobile technologies I want to mention, but also this idea about democratizing the idea of making and creating. I think you're familiar with the sort of maker spaces and lots of these ideas. And some of that is definitely part of this discussion of how people can participate in that. And I think that's who participates, who has a voice, who's making decisions, those kinds of issues. Similarly, back to the space theme for just a second, we have things where there's this giant triumph that certainly lent itself to a large amount of science and scientists that participated, but it really benefited society. Like everyone celebrated in that moment. And we certainly have issues, as Nilüfer kind of pointed out, these wicked problems, things around education and environment and health and economy. All these kinds of issues are exactly these wicked problems. So one of the concepts we had was this idea of, could we have this idea of micro-volunteerism, that people would volunteer for things on small scales? So often people think, well, I'm going to volunteer. I don't have like a Saturday afternoon to go to Habitat for Humanities. I don't really want to do a kind of a broad program, but I don't know, I'm at the stoplight. I have like 30 seconds. What can I do here? So how could you volunteer and sample your world in interesting ways? So one of the motivating kind of quotes we had at the time was, bureaucrats sometimes do not have the correct information while citizens and users of resources do. And I think all of us kind of feel a kinship with that. There's decisions made often by people that are not informed. They're not directly in touch with the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. Now, there's a lot of different themes that we touched on in this work. I'm not going to go through all of them, but certainly things around the DIY culture and citizen science I will say something about. So another quote that I liked, and it's actually got a lot of different attributions, but if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And so the idea was, well, if we couldn't even know what we have, how can we make decisions and try to change it? So that's a little bit of also the motivating factor of this. Now, one of the things that we looked at early on was this idea of there were these apartment buildings that had very high levels of particulate matter in them. And one of the things that people did in Williamsburg is they made these kind of almost activist posters to point out the problem, because the EPA came and said, there is no problem here. We've made measurements, there's no problem. And the people said that's not right. And in fact, they went and did their own measurements that on their own took them a lot of money to do this, and they made these measurements. This was in the kind of 90s, I believe. And it ends up that, in fact, there was a dry cleaner nearby, and if you sampled during the times this dry cleaner was putting off a lot of VOCs and different pollutants in the air. And so the citizens really made that voice and had the EPA come back and change that policy. Now, just to give you some background, I think citizen science, we can talk about lots of different things. It has some origin story, even further back, but most people maybe think about there's this thing called the Christmas bird count, where people were charged to go out and count birds out in public. People say, well, I don't know, I can't identify these birds. But in fact, it ends up, it's one of the longest running data sets about birds, bird migration, and it comes from basically, I don't know, I'm an untrained birder, so I don't know, but people that basically have not a great skill at this, but they all participate. When we think about citizen science, I think it also taps into this idea about curiosity and often how we're curious about our world and the environment around us. And at the time, a lot of us, and we're still doing this, we're kind of just staring at our glass screens on our phone. And it was like, well, maybe this is an opportunity to get people to look up and be curious. And I think all of us remember sometime in our backyard finding a weird caterpillar or finding a strange flower or a strange rock. And so part of that spirit of curiosity, how could that play out into our world now? So another theme that we drew on inspiration from was tell me, I forget, show me, I remember, involve me, I understand. And so how could we get people involved in this process in some way and get it to really be participatory? So you might think, as you stand here, I don't know, what's the temperature in this room? Which direction am I facing? Which way is the wind blowing? Is the air safe in here or out there? What's the air quality like? What's the pollen count today? Can I go outside and not get sunburned? What's the noise pollution here? Is it safe? Are there pesticides used on those plants? Is that water safe to drink? Are there any VOCs in that carpet I need to know about? Are my children's toys safe? And this is what our mobile devices tell us about the environment around us. How many bars we have. Now, you'll see this is dated because it says 3G, but we still haven't come a long way. The claim at the time that I made was that if you told someone 20 years ago you had 3 bars, they'd go, I didn't even know you owned a bar. When did you start buying bars? So this idea of entering in a vernacular that we could talk about bars as a measurement, why can't we have other vernacular about other signals around us and other kinds of ways of sensing our world? And that's the premise was to think about the mobile device as not a phone, but as a supercomputer radio station with sensors. And that was sort of the concept. Why couldn't it be kind of more participatory in measuring and sort of exploring our environment? A lot of different projects we did in this. I want to sort of just tell you this was just an interesting concept because this was actually from a patent, I'm not involved with this patent, but many years ago someone said, oh, you'll just take things from the world, you'll put them into your little phone, and it'll do basically, just check all the elements there and tell you what it is. So this is kind of a vision of what things could be. It's strange there's already patents. There's a lot of thinking about what this would be. Certainly one of it was educational. How could you bring science literacy? I mean, just kind of the scientific process. I wonder if there's more bees in my neighborhood than my friend's neighborhood, and you could sort of start to explore that. How could you get professional scientists and stakeholders access to better data? There was a lot of work we did with the EPA and other scientists. And then developing new user experiences for mobile phones. At the time, I know this sounds hard to believe, but phones were primarily kind of voice, and there was a little bit of text messaging. This is well before smartphones, okay? So I was like, what would you use phones for? I don't know. And create public awareness and understanding of the relationship between humans and the natural environment. But primarily, it was how can this tool become a tool for democracy? How can it really involve people to have a voice or a way of measuring or reporting about their world? We did a lot of projects in that space. I'm just going to skim through them. But this is early kind of us hacking phones to add sensors as an air quality sensor. We did some studies in different parts of the US and Africa and other places that studied and data sets around air quality. So one thing is we started to look at different gases and particulates in the air because that was primarily a huge health concern at the time. And we noticed this thing, which still sort of exists, the Prius effect, which is people that are driving and they're trying to optimize the 100 mile per gallon number, and they're kind of going slower and faster. It's almost like it's a game for them. And clearly now we have, watches and Fitbits and things that are telling us how well we're doing, or trying to, did I stand up enough today? Did I walk enough today? So could you play this gamemanship into other kinds of social justice and community actions? We thought about at least things around air quality. Could you have things that would be on the mobile infrastructure, so in the world around us? Could it be indoor with us? And could there be things out in public places? And there's challenges to each one of these. One of the things we did is when Gavin Newsom was mayor of San Francisco, he let us attach sensors to any city vehicle we wanted. So we did a bunch of that. One of the things we did is we put them on street sweepers. There's problems with street sweepers, but they'll give you one positive. They cover almost every bit of a city in a couple days. So you and I and all of us in this room, we don't go down every street every day. Now, some things do, like maybe mail trucks or mail delivery individuals, but things like that. So we put different kinds of sensors on these trucks. The other nice thing was they all came together at night, and we can calibrate the kind of sensors. And what they did is they collected data all over San Francisco. So every day they would go out, and I think we realized that San Francisco really only has 2 or 3 locations that actually measure air quality. We did a bunch of surveys early on to understand where people went to find air quality. And so we got much finer grain resolution data, and you could drill down. So not surprisingly, things like Hunters Point and some other locations that you would expect to have more industrial usage, reporting sort of worse air quality. Okay, I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can kind of see how this system plays out. Another view is we said people couldn't really take action on that. And so we thought in someone's own home or indoors, people can often do more with that kind of data set. And so also that we spend a lot of time indoors. And so we built design systems where we would measure those same kind of data sets about air quality, but in your home. And you could start to notice things like when I vacuum or when I open a window, or things that you take action on that change the air quality, and you would sort of react to it. Lots of kind of interesting anecdotal stories happen from this. People that, suddenly we also shared this amongst their friends. So the same way you could see who's maybe online or what music someone's listening to, this would say, hey, your friend's air quality just got really bad. You go, what's going on? Like, yeah, I burnt some salmon. Okay, so you'd have these funny stories that would develop. But it created a kind of dialogue about that. And they would also talk about best practices. Oh, here's what I did to improve things. It's much more actionable, some of the kind of technology of the time. This was done in a pretty interesting longitudinal study. We had almost a 6-month-long study, which is, at least for HCI, a little longer. Usually it's, people tried it for a week, and it was kind of interesting. There's a lot of novelty effect. We really tried to get out of that. There was statistically significant improvement in all of the homes from this study. So that's showing kind of you versus your friends. So you've seen these things before. You're using more energy than your friends. They're walking more than you. It was a little bit of that sort of carrot and stick kind of idea. The other one was he thought, what if we could just put these out in public? And this we gave to very different communities. So we made sort of sensors that had different kinds of ways of sensing, and they're on a map. This was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when I was at Carnegie Mellon. We gave them to a group of bicyclists. We gave them to a homeless community. We gave them to some parents, and we gave them to some activists. And the thing you'll notice is they want to tell very different stories. They move them around in different ways. The bicyclists obviously want to put them at places where there's a lot of heavy bike activity and traffic and issues they want to draw attention to. And the activists have a much more kind of wide narrative of what they want to do. Again, communities really want to tell more personal stories, and they want to have ownership over these. I don't know if you caught the name of this project. Pipe bomb. That was intentional because I knew that when we put things in public that look like that, people would think they're bombs. And in fact, more of these got confiscated by the police, and I got more phone calls about it than imaginable. But I did predict that. We put our name on all of them and said, contact us. But it's just a lesson. If I leave my mobile phone in public, you're less likely to be worried about if I start sticking strange boxes up. Maybe you do. But could you use this data for other kinds of things? We thought maybe you'd plan cleaner routes through the city. Maybe you've had other ways of interacting with the data. We made T-shirts that responded to air quality, so you personally became a sensor. So you'd walk into a a smoky bar or restaurant, and you'd sort of light up and people would go, what's going on? Like, go outside. So it was really a strange narrative and almost performative the way people interacted with that. We thought about new kinds of signs for cities, how that would be provocative of how we would sort of start to report air quality. We made small little robots you could throw onto poles. They would sort of scamper up with magnets and take sensors. You could knock on the pole and they'd run back down. Just a lot of kind of public engagement of how people would work with these sensors. We designed some just very simple balloons as part of a public workshop where people built sensors with us, and then we gave them the sensors embedded with a helium-filled balloon that they could bring around. And so as it measured air quality, it lit up in different ways. And so this was interesting because people would sort of obviously come over, they go, hey, what's the cool balloon? They go, well, here, take it. Like, what is it? And so suddenly this kind of, that's why we had the spectacle computing, because this idea was a spectacle, but then people were suddenly drawn into this idea of what you would want to do with this technology. And they got in narratives, again, with neighbors and friends about, wait, what is this? Wait, I'm going to bring it to my kid's school. I'm going to put it on some other location. These are just pictures from the workshop, and we had instructions on how people built this. I'm going to say something else about this idea of micro-volunteerism, and it connects with some of the kind of maker movement ideas. Individuals must become more united and more increasingly different. And that kind of touches a lot on, I think, what Nilüfer was talking about. Like, we want to get together, but we also don't want this homogenous viewpoint. We want to have a differentness. That's really important. One of the things we thought about was the scenario of maybe you're participating in a local beetle that's damaging trees, and so as you see them, you take pictures, you report them, you're sort of helping a scientific campaign, and that was like a model that we had thought about developing. But we thought, what about if other people, not just scientists, but anyone could create that campaign? So you might care about some other issue. Hey, why are these school buses always idling in front of schools? Maybe we can just report those, get a measurement. And you might create your own campaign. It might obviously be location or time dependent. And this idea of, well, I have 35 seconds. I'm at the corner of, Shattuck and such. Could I take a picture? What do you need right here? Oh, the trash can's full. This is what's going on. So we built this system and let people also look at the data from different perspectives, which is a big challenge because you can obviously look at the data and report it in different ways. And the idea was, that was a system called Sensor that we built, that we deployed. That did actually get built. Back to our familiar friend here, because he talked a little bit about this democratic angle in relation to maker spaces. He said, and most important, we need not only the folks that, somehow he left out Berkeley. I think he's like it's kind of blurred or something. But really, and most important, we need not only the folks at UC Berkeley, or MIT or Stanford or the National Institute of Health, but also the mom in West Virginia tinkering with the 3D printer, the girl on the south side of Chicago learning to code, the dreamer in San Antonio seeking investors for his new app, the dad in North Dakota learning new skills so he can help lead the green revolution. That's how we're going to overcome the challenges we face, by unleashing the power of all of us, for all of us, not just for those of us who are fortunate, but for everybody. That means creating not just a quicker way to deliver downtown takeout, but also a system that distributes excess produce to communities where too many kids go to bed hungry, not just inventing a service that fills your car with gas, but also creating cars that don't need fossil fuels at all. And so that sort of spirit is very much at the heart of the interest that we have in this citizen science, but also how there could be new democracies and new ways of people participating. We've seen that. For those of you maybe less aware, things like Twitter actually came out of an activist movement. It actually started as an art project called Text Mob, which was designed as helping activists stay in communication using lightweight text messaging during the 2004 Democratic National Convention. At the end of that convention, the people that built that system were without a job, and they ventured out to California. They found a company, Odeo, which eventually became Twitter, and Jack Dorsey's even said, oh yeah, that's where we got the idea. So things that we use today are really influenced by these activist projects. Let me just finish on not just, again, this kind of scope of citizen science projects And you have to realize some of these were before we have lots of things where we're used to delivering services where we get food and we get cars and we get bikes and we get scooters. This was, what are the models that are not so economically driven but more socially driven? The final things that we ended up doing in this space is doubling back because one, there was really no low-cost particle sensor that was available, and so we worked to really make something that had a different form factor, and you could start to wear it and look at the data in more provocative but also playful ways. We decided we wanted to think about how children could encounter technology not first as a glass screen that they tapped on, but maybe it was embedded in their toys. This was a challenge because we didn't want to make it an alarmist kind of interaction that would light up and say danger, but just let them know that the water quality is different from their pool to their bathtub, and that when they're digging in the soil that it's a little bit different when it's sand or if it's a different kind of soil or somewhere with air quality. I realized we had early on dislodged for the first time some data from the EPA. It's amazing how many documents I had to sign to just say, can I have the public air quality data for the San Francisco Bay Area? And after numerous legal documents, I was able to get it and put it into a service that was called Ergo. It was an air quality. You could actually put in a zip code and you'd get daily or hourly reports. This was before there was GPS on phones. Okay, so there was no smartphones. You could see the technology, and now I think you're aware this comes to your phone now without you doing anything. The air quality is right down in the corner of your map service. Took them a while to get there. Okay. I'm really inspired by Rachel Carson, who's an activist for a lot of environmental justice. She says, the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe, the less taste we shall have for its destruction. And the last thing I want to mention is a project that is very different, but has this kind of hint of kind of collective action, but it's less around a kind of environmental, it has an environmental story, but it's around energy. Now, I just want you to think for a minute about how you might plug into the wall and you get power, and you don't really think about it. It's like, okay, get it, just kind of universal. In a lot of parts of the world, it's actually not always that functional. It has lots of issues, but what if we changed your perception of electrical energy to have more of a materiality to it? Here's the thought experiment. Think of someone you love. This happens to be my son many years ago. Someone that maybe goes out, swings on a swing, generates some energy, and they collect that energy while they're playing. They bring that energy home to you, and they give it to you as a gift. And then you read a book that night to the energy that got created. And the question is that somehow different than just plugging into the wall? And the claim is that it is. It's created by a loved one. It's a gift. It has an emotional connection. And these are not things we talk about when we're giving things like energy. We talk mainly about reducing consumption. But we could talk about different ways of sharing or keeping or collecting energy. And so as some experiment and there's sort of critical design in that area, we know that people harvest this on a kind of house scale, but what about little smaller scale devices? What about devices that report more about where our energy is coming from when we actually charge? But also, are there little sort of devices, these are energy mementos, that actually would collect these little bits of energy? So again, imagine your grandfather turning a hand crank. Would you put that onto the shelf and say, that's the energy I made with Grandpa? Would you have that kind of relationship with that? We did make some energy parasites. These are explicitly more of an art project that you could place onto public infrastructure to essentially steal energy, quite honestly. But they also create a narrative of where the opportunities are to engage with energy and then opportunities to use it. So things like you could attach it to a bus or sort of a tram. You could put it onto the front of a headlights, as you see I'm doing there, to sort of steal some energy from someone's headlights, into a public fountain to take some energy out of the falling water, or on an escalator so you can actually steal some of that energy. Now, you're not getting free energy, but these are sort of public provocations about where these little bits of energy could be harvested from. And the point I want to make is that now, 10 years later, the concept that we had at the time in this research was, well, what if people could kind of like give a penny, take a penny? What if you could kind of leave a little bit of energy to people on the bus when you got off, or gave it to some bicyclists? Or we have no mechanism to share energy. And now we do. Took them, again, about 15 years to kind of get to this. But these are concepts that we started to explore around collective action and what the meaning would be behind that. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of little bits, and I kind of gave a lot of things to chew on, but I want to give us some time to discuss things. I'll leave with just this last quote from Walter Benjamin about the idea of the aura, because I think that captures some of these concepts. He says, "The authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from its substantive duration to its testimony to the history from which it is experienced." So the kinds of energy we create, the kinds of things we sense, the kinds of ways we participate gives narrative and personal aura and difference to the world, and that's exciting to me. Thank you.
At this point, if I could ask Nilofer and Eric to join me on stage here.
That's cool.
I'll just have some introductory questions, and then I'll open up to our audience of students and the public as well. So this is a series about design from bits to buildings, and clearly both of you use design in your work, but there are also aspects of being scientists, running experiments, being engineers, working out all the technical details, being artists as well. And I just want to ask how you see yourself and your work, and how you balance those different modes of working.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that all of those hats exist. I definitely feel that the most successful projects that I've worked on with students and myself have been those that make a kind of scientific contribution. They push some technical frontier, but they also become like, a public provocation in some ways. They're shown as often a sort of serendipitous encounter someone has. I always say the projects that people are the best are those that people have strong reactions to, and that includes people that hate the project. The worst is when people are just, I didn't really notice it. But I'm pretty clear that I'm operating, of course, with some hat as faculty in electrical engineering and computer science at a leading public institution, but also as an artist.
Yeah, I would say same. I think I'm also very fortunate to be in spaces like the iSchool here, and also human-computer interaction as a field where you're allowed to do that. And you can have different pieces of work focus more on one aspect or the other. Now that I'm faculty, it's also a question of what are students excited about doing, and so I enjoy changing my hat based on what the student is excited about working on together and making contributions across these different spaces.
Great, thank you. Next question is a little longer. So, Eric, your work that you shared with us today is a lot about communities situated in a physical space, like a particular neighborhood of Berkeley or Pittsburgh. And Nilofer, the communities you talked about are distributed online, but with some shared concern or interest. And so my question is about the interaction of the different communities we form and facilitate online with institutions and governments that are thinking mostly still about physical spaces. So you mentioned, the police collected some of your sensors, and I think Eric, you also mentioned right at the beginning that just right now we're talking about AB5 in California, right, classifying gig workers as employees. And how do you think about where and when is it the right thing and appropriate to apply the structures we have from our physical experience with each other to communities that are facilitated online, and when might you seek different solutions? Like I think of Dynamo as taking ideas from labor organization, but applying them in a very different way so that they're effective online.
Yeah, fascination from online spaces comes from my own experiences. When I was in high school and even in middle school, in school we would all coordinate that when we go home, and this was dial-up internet, at like 5 p.m. everyone's going to be on Yahoo Chat, and it would be the same people in our class, but we would always be text chatting with each other. We would be text chatting with people around the world, and that sort of started my fascination around these online spaces. Really early in my work, I read a lot of literature about how it's impossible to create trust with people you don't see face to face. And I would read that and say, it is, and I've seen it, and I've like been in these spaces. So a lot of my fascination comes from how do we take some of the things that people have very well established in real world or physical spaces and create those same kind of structures. I'm really interested in architectural design and designs of sort of physical spaces, and how limited our designs of online spaces are in contrast. So bringing some of those ideas and insights into the online world. Some of the limitations are, like you say, governments are still very much physical, but increasingly we're seeing environments like Mechanical Turk where people from all over the world were participating, and so or like Twitter, where people are from all different sorts of places and there's no singular jurisdiction for any of it. So that creates these new kinds of problems where what does accountability look like? How do we do anything in this space that we're all participating in? And so I think those are some of the open questions there.
Niloufer's work on this idea of, trustworthiness and how you build these kind of social relationships is fundamental, and it was really missing from a lot of the work we did early on. It was mainly localized, so it's like you would be in your neighborhood, and there's some power in that because you can usually know that neighborhood, that relationship. And the vision was that these data sets would somehow just be part of civic government, like they would just draw on them naturally like they would with other data sets. I mean, it's not exactly what happened, but I mean, that was some of the vision at the time. We started to definitely think about how to involve the others, like people that maybe were not in your immediate area. So that project I mentioned briefly, Sensor, that let you do your own campaigns, that was to engage people who might say, I actually care about fracking in Pennsylvania. I live in California. Can I participate in this campaign? So you're not actually measuring it, but maybe I get some of the data and maybe I get pictures, or I'm supposed to identify features that are fracking violations, or I can sort of participate somehow and not be there. And similarly, if I arrive to a location, the vision was that you would kind of step off the train or the plane, or and you would say, I wonder what campaigns are going on around here. I have kids, and so I go, oh, actually, there's a couple people who are also concerned about some issues around K-12 children, and so I want to participate in those campaigns while I'm visiting for this week. So we wanted to think about this more networked way of doing it. Didn't really pan out that way, but that's definitely was part of the vision.
My next question is probably mostly for Eric, but Niloufer, please feel free to jump in as well. So emerging technology is often seen as a democratizing force, as the price of technology goes down with Moore's law, really powerful tools become accessible to a much wider audience. And so initially that was often seen as a very good thing, right? Personal computing gave us desktop publishing and media creation. So the barriers for participating came down. But at the same time, it also happened that while we are now all photographers with really powerful cameras, it's become much harder to have a career as a photographer. We can all produce music in our in our bedrooms, but it's hard to make a living as a musician. We can all publish writing online, but journalism is under immense pressure. And I'm wondering what you see, if you see some kind of connection there between making technology accessible for all, but also us not really having resolved how that leads to, good jobs in those areas for people.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. I mean, certainly we want to have more participation. We want to have that broader, and when the barrier is lowered because of either economics or accessibility or whatever limiting factors removed, that's an exciting chance to design and transform. But it also, as you can tell, I mean, even just, Twitter and all these social media sites, now we're drowning in, all kinds of news and data, and it's hard to get the signal. And even when I think back to when we did the collections of different air quality, what people often did was they would find one red dot and they'd obsess about, like, why is that near my house or something. And I think it was hard because, with my science mind, I thought, oh, that could be the sensor was drifting. Maybe there was like a dump truck went by right at that moment. There's a lot of factors, but that was hard for people to have a debate about the data. And so it seemed like there needed to be ways and mechanisms for people to debate those data sets, because we see this all the time. Anytime you flip on the news, it's sort of like, this is what the numbers show. Flip channel. No, this is what the numbers show. And they're very different viewpoints. And so actually, that's why I get inspired by some of the work that Nilüfer is showing, because it's showing how these debates can actually move forward and not get into a quagmire of constant sort of arguments about things. But this other idea of, essentially, I realized when we were doing those projects, we were actually working close with the EPA, and they really like the work. They're really good about it. But I realized something that maybe I was just naive about, which was that the EPA is not really an agency around public health. They're a regulatory agency, and so they need to have very highly calibrated equipment so that they can actually prosecute and sort of lay forth different legislative actions against mainly companies that are in violation of sort of discharging kind of pollutants. What they got excited about was that people that never really realized what the EPA was and that what kinds of variations in, say, air quality or water quality, they were participating and realized what that phenomenon was and were kind of excited about the science. So that was another angle that became interesting. But they would not be able to use citizen data to go and sort of prosecute, some trucks that were spewing out pollutants in your neighborhood. Just wasn't something they could get involved with.
Maybe one final question for you, Nilüfer, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. If I take a step back and think of the different projects you presented, they kind of fall under maybe a banner of computational organizational design. So right now, the field of organizational behavior, studies and develops guidelines, and part of your systems then turn that into algorithms that determine when and how people interact with each other online. And I just wanted to get your general sense on the promises and perils of that. Seems like good things can come out of that if you do it very thoughtfully, but maybe not so positive results might result if you go about it in a more naive way. And I think you already talked about this labor of action that cannot be written into software. So where in the future, as more and more of our work and school lives are directed by apps and algorithms, right? Where's the right place for those algorithms, and what do we really want to leave up to deliberation between people?
That's a lot of questions. Thank you. I think for the first part, I'm increasingly finding myself thinking of design of physical spaces, design of organizations, design of socio-technical systems like algorithms and boxes that you can click on, and also more lately, design of law and design of government organizations like the EPA that you were talking about are all very linked to each other. Some of the tools that you created for taking signals from the environment is sort of linked to how the EPA works, and it's sort of linked to how people think it works, and what other organizations exist, and who's doing the polluting. So I'm thinking that all of these sort of, maybe we need to think about them more holistically, and maybe we've been thinking about it too much in these various buckets, whereas now everything is so blurred together that maybe we need to think about it differently. And certainly you can learn from organizational behavior about how to design algorithms, and you can learn maybe from algorithmic systems how you can design better legal frameworks. So I think there's this space of maybe higher level design values and goals that then embeds itself in different ways that we need to be thinking about. And what was the second part? I forgot.
Just where are there any clear boundaries for how to make the decision where adding algorithmic decisions is good and where you should absolutely not do that and let people, argue about their values and decisions?
Yeah, I think that goes back to this sort of very vague thing that I said about design. I think it's at the heart of it is what are the values and what are the goals? And I think that should frame what are we designing for. So if the values and the goals are democracy, then you can start thinking about, well, we do need people to participate in various ways. We do need deliberation. I think local government, a lot of the things that Eric is engaging with is actually our ideal vision of what democracy should be doing. It should be in the service of the people. And so I think if we start from that point, then we can say, okay, is deliberation something that we need here, or is it maybe something that could be abstracted away and maybe routinized, and then once it is abstracted away and turned into a routine, then it can become a law, or it can become an algorithm, or it can become a table that we put in the middle and it means something. And so I think the thing that we need to pay a lot of attention to at the center of this is what is the value and what is the goal, and then go from there.
Great, thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience. We have 2 ushers with microphones, so just raise your hand and a microphone will find its way to you. First question in the back here.
Hi. This question is more for Mr. Palos, but I believe that both of you may have an interesting insight on it. I'm really curious what your opinions are in terms of scaling certain crowdsourcing platforms or, as you were discussing, citizen science, specifically within the realm of climate change participation. In many cases, you're not really able to provide an economic incentive, and emotional incentive sometimes isn't enough. A totally radical different example would be you tell a smoker, oh, you might get lung cancer from this, but it's not enough to make them stop. So how can you tell someone, oh, you're reading air pollution in your home that may lead to something down the line, but you have to pay to do something about it, or you have to take time out of your day. But not only within examples of personal use, I'm curious about addressing the entire issue at scale. What are, I guess, both of your opinions on what we can do to create these platforms where we really are able to get the people who do want to contribute to perform an action to do so, but I guess incentivize them to do so and organize it in such a way that actual impact can be made even from remote locations?
Yeah, okay. Scaling is the hard part for sure. I think there's a couple of comments on that. So so starting on a smaller level, when we had people that would you could collect your own air quality data, for example, at some point you go, that's just sort of a drag. Now I just got to carry this thing around and it's always buzzing and so we thought a little bit about that. Some of the techniques are things you probably would imagine. One is that we would certainly want to maybe incentivize it through some kind of rewards or badging, which people were really interested in and remain interested in socially. Another one is to actually tell people that their data is being used. So you'd get something saying, hey, we changed the bus stop location and it was due to your data, or your data was used last night at the public town hall, or in the sort of the governor used your data for just some way of letting them know that they were actually making a difference. Now, maybe it's hard to find their exact data points in there, but that was one part of it. Another one was to think about gaming. So when Pokemon Go came out, for example, there were different reporters calling me about oh, this is like another game. I'm like, this is great because people are actually looking around. They're incentivized to go places and collect things. And we had actually hypothesized a game. For example, just say there was a game. I'm not a good game designer, so this is why it's a bad game. But say bees are an important part of the game, and so you're going to go collect these bees, and there's something about bees. But the bees could be, pollen counts. And so going to places and collecting data that's useful about people that suffer from asthma or other issues of pollen also helps you win the game and get bees. And I mean, these kind of things I think kind of work. Now, the bigger question is much harder that you're asking is how do you do this at scale? you need to have leadership models of people that can kind of aggregate these data sets, people that can also, or algorithms. This is something that would be really useful. Is you might have an issue around whatever public transportation or buses or air quality, whatever the issue, and somehow you would be doing this campaign, and it would say, actually, this was solved. Stockholm used this particular model, and they have a similar population or density, and so you could try to find these global problems that others were solving. You have this sense of, wow, yeah, I'm not alone. My neighborhood here in Berkeley is the same as this neighborhood in, some other part of the world. And so you'd have that kind of feeling of kind of camaraderie in some sense. But yeah, there's probably some deep Nobel Prize for someone that figures out how to really do what you're asking. It's hard, and I applaud the effort. It's something I'd love to see happen, but I do think a lot of it rests with technology and people's participation. I mean, it's kind of lame that this is all about self-promotion and getting us to like places on time. Like, fine, I like getting places on time, and fine, I'll take a couple shots and post them, but that's such a weak thing. They should be doing so much more to participate in our civic engagement, and it's almost like, how dare they not do that? I mean, now we're seeing lots of public health things around watches, and we're seeing people reporting things around noise, but those are tiny baby steps. I mean, so hopefully people like you and others can speak a bigger voice and have a bigger action.
Thank you very much. This was really inspiring. And to follow up on your point about how we could do more with our phones and your work around what you call populist innovation, I find that very interesting because we live in a time where populism has reemerged in politics, and there's definitely negative implications and connotations to the word. But I see a lot of potential in doing that. Now we could call it differently, but I wonder how citizen science or this kind of work that you've been doing with online communities encounter resistance because they go against established institutions like traditional science or the click economy that polarization creates through what we have in Twitter and other platforms. Thank you.
Well, I think any kind of effort to change anything will meet resistance from how things are currently working. And so I think it's interesting to think about how change can be brought about. For me, change is brought about when a lot of people agree that this change should happen and then do something about it. And so I focus a lot of my work on how do we get to that point. And I think that deliberation is really, really important to get to that point. I was reading some of the very, very early texts that people have been written about democracy at around the time when they were just writing the US Constitution, and there were all these ideas about how would people actually participate. And it wasn't really limited to people voting. There were these early sort of processes or suggestions for even having a deliberation day, which would be a national holiday. All the schools would be open, and people in every neighborhood would go in to their local school and talk about what are the issues of our neighborhood, what are the bigger issues of the nation, and sort of talk about them and come up with formulations of what is the problem and how do we start thinking about it. And so I think that maybe, I don't know, culturally or politically, we've sort of lost that. And it is silly that we have these phones, and we potentially should be able to be doing this every day now. We don't even need really a school to be open for an entire day for it. Maybe actually the physical presence was an important component, I don't know. But getting to that point where we actually do more deliberation around these problems would, I think, actually stop some of the negative things around populism, where it's like the most immediate thing that comes to mind is, it's just falling back on, say, hatred of immigrants, for instance, and because that's the easiest thing that we can map onto our problems.
I was going to say, be very leery of kind of lazy design. So often taking existing social norms, technology comes out, and the technology just does the exact same thing. Technology, that should be a pivot point to say, hey, let's change the way people participate. Let's change the way that things are manufactured or made. Let's change the sort of justice to a particular demographic. I mean, it's so lazy when you see someone design something and they go, oh, and well, we take photos, so we'll just take more photos and we can share it. Like, duh, this could be so many other things. There's many examples like that.
This question is for Nilüfer, and I was wondering what got you interested in the topic of collective action in particular, and do you see a limit to what collective action can do for issues in the future? Thank you.
I guess what got me interested was my own personal politics and involvement and sort of my reactions to some things that I thought were problematic and thinking through what can we do about them. I didn't set off to work on collective action. It sort of, towards the end of my PhD work, I sort of looked back and to think about what is the thread that brings us all together, and I felt like, oh, it's this, my constant sort of need to bring people together to do something. And I sort of framed that as collective action. What are the limits? I mean, scale is a huge limit, and that's why we end up creating governments and organizations and rules and guidebooks, because we can't deliberate on every single thing. It takes a lot of energy and labor, and so the ways that we codify those things into established procedures that we just keep doing over and over, or established even tools or spaces or these different things. And I'm really interested in when that happens as well, and what are the limits to that.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I had a question for Nilüfer, and I think right now a lot of focus has been put on, especially with design, on human-computer interaction. Do you think there should be a broader discussion about possibly a shift towards like group computer interaction or collective computer interaction as opposed to an individual focus, more of like a collective focus like you were talking about?
I think we're already there. I just think we haven't changed the name. I've actually been in rooms when people have discussed, is it time to change the name yet? Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the name actually comes from a place of designing mouses and keyboards and actual, what we would call a person sitting and trying to interact with a computer. How do we design it so they can actually do that? And then it's sort of branched out and become this huge thing. I think it's safe to stick with the name for now because it has a history and it brings people together around a methodology, around different methodologies and different goals, and it sort of gives us a shared identity, which is really important. But I think it's almost what you're saying now. A lot of it is human-to-human interaction mediated by technology. A lot of it is collective, people, groups of people working towards different kinds of goals, and sometimes technology is there or not. Sometimes technology is art, and I find that really fascinating. I've just been thinking so much about your robots that go up the poles and come down. I think that's fascinating. So yeah, I think it's much broader.
Hi, thank you so much for both of the talks. This question is primarily for Professor Nilüfer Salehi, and my question is, well, I was really interested by how your work really is inspired by, like, observes and problematizes a lot of the abusive and harmful, hateful content that platforms like Twitter propagate and enable. And I think your work really exposes a lot of learnings in the area of what makes a valuable conversation and influential interactions. I'm really curious to learn how you envision companies like Twitter or like institutions that create these online platforms drawing from your work, and what in general do you think are the frameworks that these platforms can adopt to learn from all of the learnings that academic work exposes?
Yeah, I think Twitter moderation is so terrible right now that I really can't imagine, unless there's a big overhaul in how they do things, that they could create new ways that they could sort of incorporate some of this. But some of the things that I've been thinking about are, do we even really want moderation to be run by the company that's running the platform, or do we want it to be a separate thing? Because that also has strange power dynamics to it as well. So some of the things I've been thinking about are what are adjacent organizations. So you have ACLU, for instance, but what would the ACLU for online harassment look like? And what would their relationship be to the people being harassed, to the platforms? What kind of tools and sort of conversation venues would they need with the platforms to maybe be able to get some data or enforce certain decisions? What kind of resources could they provide to the people who are targets of harassment? So I think that we need to sort of think a little broader than just, and I think it's important what design decisions does the platform make, but it's also important to think about the range of stakeholders that exist and what other ways could we intervene.
Let's maybe take one more question.
Okay. Hello, thank you both for your talk. This is more for Nilofar. So when it comes to like designing online platforms, how do you balance like privacy at the same time as like encouraging familiarity? Like I feel like it's hard for people to become engaged with each other and more familiar with each other if they still want to like remain anonymous. So I'm just curious on your insight for that.
Yeah, sure. So we actually, in both the projects that I presented today, people were completely anonymous, so they chose screen names. And they sort of decided on the spot how much they wanted to share with other people about their sort of real identity or some of the things that might be identifiable about them. I think almost no one shared anything identifiable. And so a lot of the trust that was built, a lot of it was based on shared experience. So there was a lot of storytelling of like, these are my experiences and oh, that resonates with me because like this happened to me as well, especially with the accessibility design. There was maybe a whole day where people were just sharing stories about the problems that they had or their family members had interacting with technology. So I think it's possible. Maybe it's not the same kind of trust as you achieve in face-to-face or when I know what your sort of school ID name is or what your friends call you or those kinds of things. But I think it's a trust that gets built off of shared experiences.
With that, I think let's thank Nilofar and Eric again.